Good evening, everyone. Good evening. It's good to be with you again this evening. I look, and we've been blessed to be here for a few years now, to come and to sing. This time always stops to remind where we've come from, but remind us that we have a ways to go. We look at the faces in some of the pictures and we see sometimes the tiredness on the faces of the people. One thing about it, there was always a song. This song says, I don't feel no ways tired, and I can't give up now. How many believe we've come too far? I don't feel no ways tired. always say that I'm a blessed man to be able, I'm a pastor, but I'm a blessed man to be able to stand and do what I do with my family. My children are here, my grandchildren are here, and there are things I want my grandchildren to see and to hear. So that makes these nights special to us. This song says, love has no color. And we've taught our children to simply learn to love. When we love, we live. Love has no color.
Music doesn't get and it's on stage in Modesto, California. Another round of applause. We also had a piano player there that I think needs a little bit of love as well. Round of applause for the piano player. So we have a little change in the program right now. We are going to be viewing a little dance right now, but unfortunately, Neira Smith took ill, and she's not going to be here today. But as they say, the show must go on. And so Kiana Irvin is going to be performing by herself. And here's what I'd like you to do for me. I'd like you to give both of them a round of applause so that Neira can hear it from home and that Kiana's ready to come out on stage. From the same Coca Theater Company. Thanks again. Next, we're going to be joined by a young man who I had the pleasure of hearing speak before at the King Kennedy Center. We're going to talk in a second, but before I do, I want to do one more acknowledgement. After this young man addresses us, we're going to see a video tribute that was prepared by Wes Page, and he's here today. If we could say hi to Wes Page, give him a round of applause. For years and usually forget to thank him. So I've done that now. Thank you very much. So, and that video will be the introduction to our keynote speaker, Mr. Bond, which we're all looking forward to. So without further ado, we're going to bring out George Bile, who's going to present from the letter from the Birmingham jail. And after him, we're going to go directly into the video tribute. George Bile.
While confined here in Birmingham jail, I came across your recent statements called activities and untimely. I think I should indicate the reason for my being here in Birmingham. I have the honor of serving as president of the Southern Leadership Conference, an organization operating in every southern state with headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia. We have some 85 affiliate organizations all across the South, one of them being the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights. Frequently, we share staff, educational, and financial resources with our affiliates. Recently, our affiliate here in Birmingham invited us to be on call to engage in a non-violent direct action campaign. We readily consented, and when the hour came, we lived up to our promise. So I, along with several members of my staff, am here because we were invited here. I am here because I have basic organizational ties here. Beyond this, I am here because injustice is here. Just as the prophets of 8th century BC left their little villages and carried their "Thus saith the Lord" far beyond their particular hometowns, and just as the Apostle Paul left his village of Tarsus and carried the gospel of Jesus Christ far beyond his particular hometown, I too am compelled to carry the gospel of freedom far beyond my particular hometown. Like Paul, I must constantly respond to the Macedonian call for aid. You may well ask, why direct action? Why sit-ins, marches, and so forth? Isn't negotiation a better path? You are exactly right in your call for negotiation. Indeed, this is the purpose of direct action. Non-violent direct action seeks so to create such a crisis and foster attention that a community that has consistently refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks so to dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored. We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Frankly, I have yet to engage in a non-violent direct program that has been well-timed according to the timetable of those who have not suffered unduly to the disease of segregation. For years now, I've heard, wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with a piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. It has been a tranquilizing document, relieving emotional stress for a moment, only to give birth to an infant of frustration. We must come to see with the distinguished jurists of yesterday that justice too long delayed is justice denied. The nations of Asia and Africa are moving with jet-like speed towards the goal of political independence, and we still creep at horse and buggy pace towards gaining a cup of coffee at the lunch counter. I guess it is easy for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say, wait. You express a great deal of anxiety over our willingness to break laws. This is certainly a legitimate concern, since we so diligently urge people to obey the Supreme Court decision of 1954 outlawing segregation of public schools. It is then rather strange and paradoxical to then find us consciously breaking such laws. One may well ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws and others? The answer lies in the fact that there are two types of laws, just and unjust. I agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. Now, what is the difference between the two? How does one determine whether a law is just or unjust? A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law and the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. Any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. All segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. It gives the segregator a false sense of superiority and the segregated a false sense of inferiority. So, segregation is not only politically, economically, and sociologically unsound. It is morally wrong and sinful. Thus, it is that I may say that men may obey the 1954 Supreme Court decision because it is morally right. And it is that I may urge men to disobey segregation ordinances because they are morally wrong.
Things are not perfect. We must stand as one. We must embrace change. It's time that we start to be the light of hope and share a dream to everyone. It's time to reach out. It's time to grab, to make a difference in the world we call our home. It's time for unity to live in perfect harmony. And then one day the dream will complete.
I heard Robert Carter, one of the lawyers who argued the Brown case, say that the Brown v. Board of Education decision was the Magna Carta of Black America. And it's hard to rank that with the Declaration of Independence, but if you imagine that the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution until then had not meant much to African Americans, the Brown v. Board decision tells us this means you too. You're included here. So in that sense, it has enormous importance. The country has, the Supreme Court had put the stamp of equality on African Americans, and we didn't realize how long it would take to promise come true, but the promise was enormously powerful and enormously ennobling, I think, and empowering. The Brown v. Board of Education decision said segregation was unconstitutional, but it created a wedge which allowed the nonviolent civil rights movement to argue that it was also. And that combination created the movement of the 1960s and brought us to where we are today.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage, Julian Bond.
You know, I've had many introductions, but I never had one like this. This is a great, great pleasure. It's a great, great pleasure to be here. And, you know, it's a great pleasure to be here because I have a tie to this city that some of the rest of you may have as well. I am a minister of the Universal Life Church. The Messiah of Modesto. Made me a minister, and I've never performed any minister. I've been asked to, but never done. But I feel like I'm one of you. I'm glad to be here. Bishop Inslee, the Messiah. Anyway. It's great to be here, and I have to tell you that when I got the invitation, I thought, why have these people invited me? And I thought maybe it's because they know of the close personal relationship I have with the major figure of the civil rights movement, Dr. Martin Luther King. And if you don't know about it, I'm going to tell you about it right now. And I know among the people in this hall, and people everywhere around the world have always heard somebody say, I was a student of Dr. King's. Dr. King only taught one time, only taught one class, only 8 people in the class. I am one of the 8. That means I'm one of 8 people in the universe who can say I was a student of Martin Luther King's. Now I wish I could tell you I had taken extensive notes in the class and I kept those notes until today, but I didn't do that. I wish I could tell you that I had to take down electronically the words that fell from the lips of this marvelous, marvelous man, but I didn't do that either. In fact, I remember almost nothing that passed between teacher and student in class, but I do remember one day, class was over, he and I were walking across the beautiful Morehouse College campus, and I said to him, Doc, his friends called him Doc, I said, Doc, how you doing? And he said, Julian, I'm not doing well. He said, unemployment is high, segregation is everywhere, discrimination is unbeatable. He said, I feel terrible. I have a nightmare. I said, no, Doc, turn that around, try, I have a dream. I feel down. But it's a great, great pleasure to be here, and I want to spend my few moments talking about the picture in America. The racial picture in America has improved remarkably in my lifetime, so much so that a black man is in the White House now, and a statue of Martin Luther King is on the Washington Mall. But Barack Obama's election and re-election was testament to one man's singular abilities to racial nirvana across the land. His victory didn't herald a post-civil rights. It didn't mean that race had been vanquished. It couldn't eliminate structural inequity or racist attitudes. Instead, there's evidence that it fomented them. Obama is to the Tea Party as the moon is to werewolves. There are those who say that race is history, and they have it exactly backward. History is race. The word America scrambled after all spells, I am race. And America is race. From its symbolism to its substance, from its founding by slaveholders to its rending by the Civil War, from Johnny Reb to Jim Crow, from the Ku Klux Klan to Katrina, from Emmett Till to Trayvon Martin to Michael Brown. Now this is the last year of the sesquicentennial of the Civil War, the war that claimed more American lives than all combined in our nation's history. We live in the war's legacy and its cause every day. As Faulkner taught us, the past is never dead, it's not even past. Back on the years between the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955 and the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965 with some pride. Those were the years when politicians from both parties supported the struggle for civil rights. Now they struggle to be civil. Those were the days when banks loaned money to people, and not like these days when the people loan money to the banks. Those were the days when we were powered by our and not valued for our power. Those were the days when good music was popular, and when popular music was good. Those were the days when the president picked the Supreme Court, and not the other way around. Those were the days when we had a war on poverty, and not a war. Those were the days when voters chose their politicians, and not like today, when self-serving gerrymandering and political manipulation allow politicians to choose their voters. Those are the days when the news media really was fair and balanced, and not just mouthpieces for the misinformed. But those were not the good old days. In those days, the law, the courts, the schools, almost every institution favored whites. This was white supremacy. When the Supreme Court announced in May of 1955, in the second Brown decision, that the white South could make slaves pay slowly in dismantling segregated schools, I was 1 year older than Emmett Till. His murder 3 months after the second Brown decision was more immediate to me than the court's pronouncements had been. We were nearly the same age when he was killed in Money, Mississippi for whistling at a white woman. His death terrified me, but in the fall of 1957, a group of black teenagers encouraged me to put that fear aside. These young people, the 9 young women and men who integrated Little Rock Central High School, set a high standard of grace and courage under fire as they dared the mobs who surrounded their school. I thought, this is what I can be if ever the chance comes my way. The chance to test and prove myself did come my way in 1960. Aimed for thousands of others black high school and college students across the South in a mobilization of young black people not duplicated in our country before or first through the sit-ins, then in the freedom rides, then in the voter registration and political organizing drives in the rural South. We joined an old movement against white supremacy that had deep, strong roots. My first arrest was in Atlanta when I was 20 years old. It was March of 1960, during the Jim Crow era. I led a group of my fellow students into the segregated cafeteria on the basement of the Atlanta City Hall. We passed along the steam tables, loading our trays, and as first in line, I approached the cashier. Like most Southerners, she was polite, and she told me, "I'm awfully sorry, but this is for City Hall employees only." I said, "You got a big sign out front that says the City Hall cafeteria. The public is welcome." She said, "We don't mean it." I said, "We'll stand here until you do," and she called the police, and the police came and took us away. Because nearly 200 of us had been arrested that day in various locations around Atlanta, it was decided to try one person for each group, and I was tried for mine. For the first time in my life, I stood before a judge. On either side of me were two men I'd never seen before, never met before. I quickly understood they were my lawyers. After some back and forth, the judge asked me, "How do you plead?" And I was panic-stricken. On the one hand, I knew I was guilty. Policemen had asked me to leave, and I had refused. But I didn't feel guilty. I knew I had a right to eat in that tax-supported cafeteria, and any law that said I couldn't was no law at all. I desperately looked to my left, where the older of my two lawyers was standing. He was the dean of black lawyers in Georgia. He had risked his life and limb for nearly 50 years to represent black people in courthouses in small towns where he dare not spend the night, and now, nearly in his doze, was asleep on his feet. I turned frantically to the lawyer on my right, who said in a stage whisper, "Not guilty, you fool." And I had the presence of mind to drop those last two words, or I wouldn't be standing. Now, Dr. King was the most famous and the best known of all the modern movement's personalities, but we should remember this was a people's movement.
Yes.
Most of those who made the movement were not famous, they were the faceless. They weren't the noted, they were the nameless. The marchers with tired feet, the protesters beaten back by fire hoses and billy clubs, the unknown women and men who risked job and home and life. 2 years ago, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington. Last year was the 50th anniversary of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And this year, we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. As we celebrate these milestones, we celebrate the ordinary women and men who made the movement as it was. We celebrate Robert and Jeannie Grass. On the Sunday morning after Rosa Parks' arrest, Dr. King called on his congregation to join the planned one-day boycott. Other black ministers around the city did the same, as did one white minister, Robert Grass, who pastored a black Lutheran congregation. Weeks after the boycott came to a successful end, the Grasses' home was virtually destroyed by a bomb while their family, including their 4-day-old baby, slept. We celebrate Dorothy Counts. She was 15 years old when in September of 1957, she enrolled in an all-white high school in Charlotte, North Carolina. As she walked to school, the wife of the leader of the White Citizen Council urged the boys to keep her out and the girls to spit on her. She kept on walking. Many people threw rocks on her, and many did spit on her. So many that when her mother got home, she said Dorothy's dress was so wet with spit, she could wring it out. We celebrated Hartman Turnbow, a black farmer in Mississippi, the most brutal state of the old Confederacy. I remember him, dressed like the farmer he was in coveralls, boots, and an old hat. Mr. Turnbow carried a briefcase. When he opened that briefcase, there was nothing in it but an automatic. In April of 1963, Mr. Turnbow went with a group of other black farmers to Holmes County, Mississippi, to try to register to vote. When the sheriff asked who would be the first, no one moved. Then Mr. Turnbow said, "Me, Hartman Turnbow, I came here to die for the right to vote. I'll be the first." 4 days later, the Klan firebombed his home and fired multiple shots into his living room. Mr. Turnbow fired back. Then the sheriff charged him with arson, accusing him of setting fire to his own uninsured home. We celebrate Fannie Lou Hamer. If Mississippi was the most repressive state, Ms. Hamer was its most heroic freedom fighter. When the movement came to her town of Ruleville in 1962, She was 44 years old and a timekeeper on a plantation. She joined eagerly. She gave us a wonderful slogan when she said, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired." The movement succeeded in spite of cowards planting bombs, in spite of shots fired in the darkness, in spite of lynch mobs and hooded thugs, in spite of, as Dr. King said, the brutality of a dying order shrieking across the land. And its successes have much to teach us today. As the old freedom song reminds us, ain't but one thing we did wrong, we stayed in segregation too long. Ain't but one thing we did right, and that's the day we started to fight. Yesterday's movement succeeded, in part, because the victims became their own best champions. When Mrs. Parks refused to stand up, when Dr. King stood up to preach, mass participation came to the movement for civil rights. Now it falls to all of us to continue that fight. Looking back at that movement from today, we now see a very different view of the events and the personalities of that period. Instead of the towering figures of Kings and Kennedy standing alone, we now see an army of anonymous women and men. Instead of famous orations made to multitudes, we now see the planning and the work that preceded the triumphant speech. Instead of well-publicized marches and protests, we now also see long organizing campaigns and brave and lonely soldiers often working in near solitude. Instead of prayerful petitions for government's deliverance, we now see aggressive demand, the ethic of self-reliance and self-help. We now realize our view of the movement's goals was narrow too. Seeking more than the removal of racial segregation, that movement didn't want to be integrated into a burning house. Rather, it wanted to build a better house for everyone. It marched on Washington for freedom and jobs, not for abstract freedom alone. And instead of a sudden and unanticipated upsurge in black activism in Montgomery in 1955, we now see a long and unceasing history of aggressive challenges to white supremacy that began as long ago. And instead of a movement that ended in 1968 with the death of Dr. King, we now see continued movement stretching from the ancient past until this moment, with different forms and personalities, in many places and locales, with differing methods and techniques, whose central goal is always the elimination of restrictions based on race. Each of the three great civil rights of the 1960s was followed by tragedy. Less than a month after the 1963 March on Washington, 4 young girls attending Sunday school were killed in the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. As the civil rights community savored the triumph of the passage of the Civil Rights Act, they dealt with tragedy. On June 21st, 1964, 3 civil rights workers had gone missing in Mississippi. As authorities searched Mississippi's rivers for the bodies of James Chaney and Michael Schwerney, 8 other bodies were found of disappeared black men, including 1 headless torso and 1 body cut in half. The remains of the civil rights workers were found on August 4th, 1964. Goodman was 20 years old, Schwerner 24, and Chaney 21. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was signed into law on August 6th. 5 days later, the Watts riot broke out in Los Angeles, triggered by a confrontation with the police. When it ended 6 days later, 34 citizens, most of them black, were dead. This exemplifies the freedom struggle in America. Triumph followed by tragedy, followed by defeat, hope followed by despair, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. We are such a young nation, so recently removed from slavery, that only my father's generation stands between and human bondage. Like so many others, I'm the grandson of a slave. My grandfather, James Bond, was born in 1863 in Kentucky. Freedom didn't come for him until the 13th Amendment was ratified in 1865. He and his mother were property, or chair. As a young girl, she'd been given away as a wedding present to a new bride. And when that bride became pregnant, her husband, that's my great-grandmother's owner and master, exercised his right to take his wife slave as his mistress. That union produced 2 children, one of them my grandfather. At age 15, barely able to read or write, he hitched his tuition, a steer, to a rope, and walked 100 miles across Kentucky to Berea College. College took him in. He belonged to a transcendent generation of black Americans, a generation born into slavery, a generation freed by the Civil War, a generation determined to make their way as men. Dr. King belonged to another transcendent generation, a generation born into segregation, freed from racism restraints from their own efforts, determined to make their way as free women and men. When my grandfather graduated from Berea in 1892, the college asked for the commencement address. He said then, "The pessimist from his corner looks out on the world of wickedness and sin, and blinded by all that is good or hopeful in the condition and the progress of the human race, bewails the present state of affairs and predicts woeful things for the future. In every cloud he beholds a destructive storm, in every flash of lightning an omen of evil, and in every shadow that calls across his path a lurking foe. But he forgets that the clouds also bring life and hope, that the lightning purifies the atmosphere, that shadow and darkness prepare for sunshine and growth, and that hardships and adversity nerve the race as the individual for greater efforts and grander victories. While we struggle for greater efforts and grander victories, we're still being tested by hardships and adversity. The rich have been sitting at the banquet table, and the rest of us have been on the menu. Plutarch warned, an imbalance between rich and poor is the oldest and most fatal ailment of all republics. More recently, another great man counseled, end this system, which tends to devour everything which stands in the way of increased profits. What is fragile, the environment, is defenseless before the interest of a deified market, which becomes the only rule. Francis speak in late 2013. People of color, of course, are more likely to be poor than they are rich, and they're worse off than their white counterparts. They in the face of a deified market. The median wealth of white households is 20 times greater than that of black households, and 18 times greater than that of Hispanic households, the largest ratio since this data was first collected a quarter of a century ago. Almost every social indicator, from birth to death, reflects black-white disparities. Infant mortality rates are 134% higher for blacks. Chances of imprisonment are 570% higher. Rates of death from homicide are 493% higher. Lack of health insurance, 33% more likely. The proportion with a college degree, 53% lower. And the average white American will live 4 years longer than the average black. These ills can't be addressed by individual or organized charity alone, as noble as these efforts are. It may be helpful to think about it in this way. Two men are sitting by a river, and to their great surprise, a helpless floating by. They rescue the child, and to their horror, another baby comes floating down the stream. When that child's pulled to safety, another baby comes along. One man jumps in the river for a third time, the other runs upstream. Come back, says the man, you have to save this baby. You save it, says the other man. I'm going to find out who's throwing babies in the water, and I'm going to make him stop. I once heard Professor Lonnie Guinier say that minorities are like the canaries that miners used to carry to warn them when the underground air was becoming too toxic to breathe. But too many people put gas masks on the canaries instead of eliminating the poison in the air. Too many want to put life preservers on the babies instead of stopping them from being thrown into a treacherous, dangerous. The Civil War that freed my grandfather was fought over whether blacks and whites shared a common humanity. Less than 10 years after it ended, the nation showed signs of the losers and agreed to continue black repression for almost 100 years. The freed slaves found their former masters once again controlled their fate. American slavery was a human horror of staggering dimensions, a true crime against humanity. The prophets it produced endowed great fortunes and enriched generations, and its dreadful legacy embraces all of us today. 246 years of slavery were followed by 100 years of state-sanctioned discrimination, reinforced by public and private terror, ending only after a major struggle in 1965, 2 years after Barack Obama was born. If you're 50 years or older, and I can tell that some of you are, it is only in your lifetime that racial equality before the law became a reality, and not before. For only roughly 50 years have all black Americans been granted the full rights of citizens. Only 50 years since legal segregation was ended nationwide. Only 50 years since the right to register and vote was universally guaranteed. And only 50 years since the protections of the law and Constitution were officially extended to everyone. And now we're asked to believe that 200 years of being property, followed by 100 years of legal oppression in the South and discrimination in the North, we're asked to believe that can be wiped away by 5 decades of half-hearted remediation and one black president. We're now asked to believe more than 3 centuries of horror, no permanent damage was done to the oppressors of the oppressed. We're asked to believe that we Americans are now a healed and whole people. As one historian observed, the greatest impediment to achieving racial equality is the narcotic belief that we already have. The truth is that Jim Crow, but racism is alive and well. That's the central fact of life for every non-white American, including the President of the United States. It eclipses income, position, education, race trumps us all. In his second inaugural address, Abraham Lincoln reflected on the war and its cause, slavery. The historian Eric Foner writes, in essence, Lincoln asked the nation to confront unblinkingly the legacy of slavery. What were the requirements of justice in the face of this reality? What would be necessary to enable former slaves and their descendants to enjoy fully the pursuits of happiness? Lincoln didn't live to provide an answer. A century and a half later, we have yet to do so. So we have work to do. None of it's easy. We wished our way to freedom. Instead, we've always worked our way. If our progress remains incomplete, and if too many of us have left the back of the bus for the front of the unemployment line, let's take heart. Today, we have much more to work with, and we take strength that much has changed. The changes that have come have everything to do with the work of the modern movement for civil rights. If there's much more to be done, we now have much more to do it with, much more than those pioneers who brought us this way. We have more than a century's worth of aggressive self-help and volunteerism in church and civic club and neighborhood association, providing scholarships, helping the needy, financing the cause of social justice. And we have a long history of cooperation between us and among us, of field slaves helping house slaves to poison the master, teachers taking chickens for payment when money was scarce and need was great, of neighbor's house and children, of those ahead reaching back to pull those left behind. We can't forget that Dr. King stood before and with thousands, the people who made the mighty movement what it was. We need a constantly growing and always reviving activist movement across America if we're going to maintain and expand victories in our vision for this country. From Jamestown slave pens to Montgomery's boycotted buses, these ordinary women in obscurity, and from Montgomery forward, they provided the foot soldiers of the Freedom Army. They shared with Dr. King an abiding faith in America. They walked in dignity rather than ride in shame. They faced bombs in Birmingham and mobs in Mississippi. They counter so others could stand up. They marched and they organized. Martin Luther King didn't march from Selma to Montgomery by himself. He didn't speak to an empty field at the March on Washington. There were thousands marching with him and before him, and thousands more who did the dirty work that preceded the triumphant march. We can't do it alone. Do it alone in the past. Countless other Americans of all kinds and colors have joined us. Some made the supreme sacrifice on our behalf, in democracy's behalf. The successful strategies of the modern movement for civil rights were litigation, organization, mobilization, coalition, all aimed at creating a national constituency for civil rights. Sometimes it is the simplest of acts, sitting at a lunch counter, going to a new school, a license, casting a vote. Sometimes these can challenge the way we think and the way we act. Our task is to continue to litigate, to organize, to mobilize, to form coalitions of the caring and concerned, joining ranks against the comfortable, the callous, and the cold-hearted. We marched and picketed and protested against state-sanctioned segregation, and we brought that system crashing to its knees. Today's times require no less, and in fact, insist on more. We have to fight discrimination wherever it raises its ugly head, in the halls of government, in corporate suites, or in the streets. We have to demand that criminal justice cease being an oxymoron. We know that race, more than any other factor, determines who's shot in the street by police, who's arrested, who's charged with what crime, who receives what length of punishment, and who receives the maximum sentence. We must realize our full political potential, making sure every citizen registers and votes. Anybody who does not vote is failing the rest of us He or she is a failure to all of us, an enemy of the body politic. Those who do not vote are dangerous to us all. They're as useful to as wings on a frog, and just as ugly too. And we say to those who want to represent in City Hall and the County Commissioner or in the White House, if you want us to vote for you, you had better be ready to vote for us. And if you belong to the political party that erects barriers to registration and voting, you show by your behavior that you do not believe in democracy and you do not want your fellow citizens to practice it. In his letter from the Birmingham jail, which we heard a marvelous rendition of tonight, King wrote, "Repent in this generation, not merely for the actions of the bad people, but for the actions of the good people." So too, he would say to us, good people, don't be silent, speak. Don't sit idly by, act. Racial justice, economic equality, world peace, these are the themes that occupy Dr. King's life. They ought to occupy. We have a long and honorable tradition of social justice in this country. It sends forth the message that when we act together, we can overcome. My slave-born grandfather speaks to us again. Wrong, he said, for a time may seem to prevail, and the good already accomplished seem to be overthrown. But forward in the struggle, inspired by the achievement, sustained by a faith that knows no faltering, forward in the struggle. The poet Langston Hughes wrote that black Americans want what so proudly we hailed as the twilight. We want my country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty. We want everything we ever heard about it in every 4th of July speech ever spoken. And I might add, we want it now. Thank you.
Very much. Now we're at the time where we get to have a little bit of question and answer. So there are people going up and down the aisles collecting cards. If you could pass those out, we'll get them up here and we'll get some of these questions answered. Now, Mr. Bond, I want to thank you on behalf of Modesto, on behalf of all these good people for sharing your wisdom with us, sharing your struggles. And I have to tell you, we've had 20 people on the stage before you, and we've had actors, we've had comedians, and I have to tell you, sir, you have jokes. And I think we all appreciate that. The young people in the audience, if you could stand up. I know we have a lot of students here, I see them. I want to acknowledge you. Where are you young people? There they are in the back. We've got students from Modesto Junior College, elementary students. Round of applause for all of us. Backstage, can we get a chair for Mr. Bond, please? Can we get a chair for Mr. Bond? And one more acknowledgement before we get our first card. I know we have some prior recipients of the Legacy Award in the room. If we could have you stand up. I saw one over here somewhere, Mr. Bridegroom, past Bridegroom, there he is. I know Tony's here. There we go, Reverend Anderson. Thank you to all of you as well. I'm going to go with the first question here. Sir, what would you tell a young person who feels that in today's day and age, one person just can't make a difference?
You know, there have been elections in this country decided by one person, and I would hate to think that I was the one person who could have made the difference for some stupid reason. But of course, one person can make an enormous difference. He or she can tip an election this way or that way. He or she can convince someone to behave in a better way than he or she might do. There are millions of things that one person can do to tip the balance for good or for evil. And he or she ought to be ready to make that choice, because the time may come when the pillar will slip one way or the other, and he or she will be called upon to do the right thing, and they better be ready.
Thank you. Next question, can you address the role of education in the ongoing pursuit of equality in the United States?
Well, I think it just goes without saying that all of us know that education is an important part of being a citizen of this country. If you don't have a good education, you're not likely to succeed in life. You're not likely to get a decent job. You're not likely to rise up higher in the economic ladder. And so education is just so important to all of us. It's something all of us ought to be grasping at, trying to grab now, right now while we're young and vigorous. Or if we're older, as some of us are, you can still get one. You can still knock on education door. Is that me?
That was me. Sorry about that.
Anyway, no matter your age, you can still get an education. And these community colleges are great, great places for older people who want to return to school, want to finish an education they began years and years ago. This is a great place for them to be.
If you want to have a seat there, the microphone for you, you can have a seat for the rest of the questions. Thank you. So the next question is, California and run for the U.S. Senate in 2016 or 2018? As a judge, I have to be nonpartisan.
I'm flattered by the question, but that's not going to happen.
What's your favorite memory with Dr. King?
My favorite memory with Dr. King? Well, that story I told, when I told him I have a dream. Well, I tell you, I was driving once with him. I told this earlier today someplace. I was driving from Atlanta to Gaston, Alabama, and he was in the car with me, and the driver was going terribly fast. And he was in the back seat, and he said, I would rather be Dr. King late than the late Dr. King.
So you learn something new every day here with this question. Please tell us about your experience on Saturday Night Live.
Well, it's hard for people to understand that Saturday Night Live used to be a comedy show. And I was a host during the second year of Saturday Night Live with most of the original cast there. And it was a lot of fun. They're having a big celebratory 40th year anniversary and have not invited me. But I happened to go to, I think, the 25th anniversary show and got to sit with O.J. Simpson and his wife and his mother-in-law. And it turned out, we found out later the day that he bought the gloves. Remember the gloves? If it don't fit, you must have quit. It was the day he bought the gloves. And if we had known then, what we know now, what we suspect now, what I suspect now, we might have said, why did you do that? But we didn't know.
What are your thoughts on Ferguson?
Well, this is just one of a series of horrendous actions taken on by against black men. It's almost as if, well, of course it is, that there's out on black men in police departments in the country. Where was that, in Florida, where some police department was using pictures of black men as targets for shooting practice? I mean, come on. What kind of people are these? There have been studies done of people who apply to go to police, work for police departments. And many people who work for police departments are wonderful, wonderful, honest, decent people. But they tend to be people who lean toward the frightening. And I think there's academic studies done that say a certain kind of psychological person is attracted to police work. And if that's the case, that's the reason why these awful behaviors are seen are seen as often as they are.
Can you expand on your thoughts on the way that Lyndon Johnson was portrayed in the movie Selma?
How many here have seen the movie Selma? How many of you came away with a bad impression of Lyndon Johnson? Well, believe me, Lyndon Johnson was the best civil rights president we've ever had in this country. I'm pleasantly surprised at the relatively small number who had gone to the movie but think Lyndon Johnson is a bad person. Because you can't help but look at the movie and think that Lyndon Johnson is a bad person. You know the scene where Lyndon Johnson has a meeting with Dr. King and Lyndon Johnson can't get his way. And then Lyndon Johnson calls on the telephone and says, "Get me J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI." And the next scene you see Mrs. King and Dr. King listening to that sex tape. And you say to yourself, oh, Lyndon Johnson, wiretapped King and created that sex tape. Of course, that's just made up. That never happened. Bobby Kennedy did that sex tape, not Lyndon Johnson.
That's true.
Lyndon Johnson was a good man in this instance. Lyndon Johnson has a lot to answer for in his life. But in this case, as far as voting rights are concerned, he was a decent, honest man, and he ought to be thought of.
Two more questions, and then Mr. Bond will be down here to sign some autographs briefly afterwards. Second to the last question, do you think that the hip-hop thug generation has hurt the movement?
I find it hard to answer this question because it's the kind of music that I do not follow myself. I don't listen to myself, so I don't have much of an opinion about it. So I really can't answer that question.
We'll take a pass on that. How can we help people overcome the current barriers to voting?
Well, in those states where people are required to have some kind of identification card, we've got to get an identification card for them. It's foolish to think that an identification card and we won't get one for that person. We need to help people get their ID card if it's required. And we have to keep fighting against the requirement that you have an ID card. But if it's required, we've got to help require it. That's one thing you do. And we have to make sure that those people with a ID card sign up and register to vote. There's no excuse for voting. It's relatively easy to do. And if you're not doing it, I just can't understand why people won't do it or don't do it. And these people should be treated harshly.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have some closing announcements, and then we will be taking autographs down at the bottom. Dr. Jim Johnson.
Wonderful evening. I am so proud to be a member of this committee that helps bring this event to our community every year, and I am so proud of our community for supporting this event every year. Thank you so much. We have had over the years wonderful sponsors. There is no charge for this. We invite the entire community to come and take part in this wonderful annual event. And so as you leave tonight, we hope that you might decide to help us for next year. And there are going to be people out in the lobby with some cans, and we would sure welcome a little bit of help from all of you so that we can keep this wonderful event going for the next 5 years. Thank you all. Mr. Bond will be down here tonight.
Good night, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.